And the TV series on the review table today is the Nollywood series Blood Sisters 2. 3 years after its debut season, Blood Sisters returns with a new chapter that once again plunges viewers into a world of secrets, betrayal, and deadly consequences. The 4-part Nollywood crime thriller, produced by Ebony Life Studios, seeks to build on the intrigue and suspense that made the original series one of Netflix's biggest African hits in terms of views. Directed by Kayode Kasum and Daniel Emeke Oriahi, Blood Sisters Season 2 boasts an impressive ensemble cast led by Dima-Okojie, Nancyisime, Daniel Etim Effiong, Gabriel Afolayan, Henshaw, Kehinde Bankole, and Genoveva Ume. Combining crime, mystery, and emotional drama, the series tries to raise stakes with fresh conflicts and darker twists as old wounds resurface and new threats emerge. The 4-episode season premiered globally on Netflix on June 5, 2026, continuing the story of survival and the devastating consequences of choices made in the pursuit of love, loyalty, and revenge. Now that the formalities are out of the way, the real question is whether Blood Sisters Season 2 manages to improve upon the flaws that plagued its predecessor, or whether, much like the first season, it once again proves that having 4 episodes instead of 8 simply means reaching the nonsense twice as fast. There was certainly no shortage of hype leading up to the release. In fact, the series had been gathering dust for 2 years before finally making its way to audiences. Unlike the first season, however, this chapter arrives without the Netflix original badge, a topic worthy of its own discussion and one that perhaps says more about the current state of the industry than many would like to admit. But that is a debate for another day. What deserves attention here is the sheer amount of cinematic foolishness compressed into 4 episodes. Blood Sisters Season 2 is the kind of show that makes you wonder whether common sense was deliberately locked in a room and denied access to the writer's room. For a series that desperately wants to be taken seriously as a sleek crime thriller, it often behaves like a soap opera that accidentally wandered onto a crime scene. There is madness. There is stupidity. There are moments so bafflingly absurd that you find yourself laughing, not because the show intended to be funny, but because disbelief eventually gives way to amusement. Logic is treated as an optional extra. Characters make decisions that seem specifically designed to keep the plot alive, rather than because any rational human being would behave that way. The tragedy is that Blood Sisters Season 2 is not lacking in talent. The cast is committed, the production values are respectable, and the series clearly wants to be bigger and smarter than it actually is. But ambition without discipline is merely chaos with better lighting. Watching these 4 episodes often feels like witnessing Nollywood stubbornly dancing makossa while the rest of the world is busy refining the art of storytelling. There is a difference between melodrama and drama, between suspense and contrivance, and between shocking twists and insults to the audience's intelligence. Unfortunately, Blood Sisters Season 2 spends far too much time confusing one for the other. By the end, one cannot help but admire the confidence of the people behind it. It takes a remarkable level of self-belief to present this much narrative insanity with such a straight face, and expect viewers to nod along as though none of it is completely ridiculous. Before we unpack the avalanche of madness that follows, here's a quick recap of how we got here. Blood Sisters revolves around best friends Sarah, Dima-Okojie, and Kemi, Nancyisime, whose lives spiral out of control after Kemi kills Sarah's abusive fiancé, Kola Ademola, Deyemi Okanlawon, on their wedding day. The two women dismember the body and bury the remains, setting off a chain of events that turns them into fugitives haunted by both the police and the powerful Ademola family. Throughout the first season, Sarah and Kemi spend most of their time running from the wrath of the ruthless family matriarch Uduak Ademola, Kate Henshaw, and her loyal enforcers. But just when it seems their nightmare may finally be over, the volatile Timeyin, Genoveva Ume, decides to bring down her own family, gunning down Uncle B, Ramsey Noah, Femi, Gabriel Afolayan, and Olayinka, Kehinde Bankole. The season ends with Uduak looking down on the barrel of Timeyin's gun, leaving audiences with one final question: who, if anyone, survived? By the time Blood Sisters Season 2 picks up, the explosive cliffhanger from the first season turns out to have far less impact than advertised. Despite Timeyin's trigger-happy finale, only one person ultimately loses his life. Kola remains the sole deceased member of the Ademola family, while Femi survives, albeit paralyzed. The only casualty from Timeyin's rampage is Uncle B, whose death conveniently paves the way for the introduction of his son, B Jr., Bentuitu, a man hell-bent on avenging his father. And that is where the madness truly begins. The arrival of B Jr. marks the point where Blood Sisters starts abandoning whatever identity it had in favor of becoming a poor imitation of second-rate Hollywood thrillers. His character is not just unnecessary, he is spectacularly useless, existing solely to manufacture conflict and drag the story into increasingly absurd territory. From that moment onward, the series begins to feel less like a Nollywood crime drama and more like a bad Hollywood parody written by people who mistook copying familiar tropes for good storytelling. Instead of creating compelling characters and believable motivations, the writers shamelessly borrow cliches from Western revenge thrillers, only to execute them with such little finesse that the result borders on self-parody. It is one thing to draw inspiration from Hollywood. It is another to imitate its worst habits while looking painfully awkward in the process. By the time Blood Sisters Season 2 limps to its conclusion, there is remarkably little worth remembering beyond the depressing realization that Sarah and Kemi have essentially spent 4 episodes running in circles. In a feat that deserves recognition for all the wrong reasons, the series manages to undo whatever little progress its protagonists made at the end of the first season, leaving them trapped in the exact same narrative loop, only somehow worse. But the real problem runs much deeper. This season suffers from such a staggering lack of cohesion in both its writing and direction that one begins to wonder whether everyone involved was working from different scripts. Nearly every aspect of the production ranges from mediocre to outright incompetence, to the point where the first season, which had its fair share of issues, suddenly starts looking like a masterpiece by comparison. And then there are the technical blunders, the kind that suggests nobody behind the camera cared enough to check whether what they were filming made even the slightest visual sense. Barely 5 minutes into the first episode, the illusion completely collapses. A prison van arrives at what is supposed to be the Lagos High Court, only for viewers to be greeted by an Eco-Judicial High Court sign and, hilariously, a Faculty of Engineering signpost sitting comfortably within the frame. Before the episode is over, the actual name of the university building masquerading as the courthouse is visible for everyone to see, as if the production team simply gave up pretending. By the second episode, things become even more laughable. The prison walls are virtually identical to the courthouse walls, exposing the fact that the same location was shamelessly repurposed with little regard for continuity or immersion. The disconnect between the courtroom interior and the courthouse exterior becomes so glaring that the entire setting begins to resemble a hastily assembled stage play rather than a professionally produced television series. What makes these mistakes particularly frustrating is that they were not hidden in the background or buried in a single frame. They are blatant, obvious, and impossible to miss, which raises an uncomfortable question. Did nobody behind the camera notice these errors, or did they notice and simply not care? Either answer is troubling, because these are not the kinds of mistakes one expects from a low-budget student project, let alone from a series produced by one of Nollywood's biggest studios. They are schoolboy errors, avoidable, embarrassing, and indicative of an industry that too often seems convinced that audiences will consume anything without demanding a minimum standard of competence. Perhaps the most insulting part is the apparent assumption that viewers are too distracted to notice. But audiences do notice. And nothing exposes creative laziness faster than filmmakers treating their viewers as though they are the least intelligent people in the room. And while we are on the subject of incompetence, can someone please explain why Sarah and Kemi, while standing trial, never once thought it might be useful to point out that Isime was the person who killed Uncle B and shot both her brother and sister-in-law? Apparently, in the bizarre universe of Blood Sisters, crucial pieces of evidence are treated like optional accessories. Characters simply ignore information that could save their lives because the plot demands stupidity. Then there is the utterly ridiculous courtroom sequence involving Uduak Ademola in the first episode. Instead of being questioned or cross-examined by the defense, she launches into an extended monologue as though she is simultaneously the witness, the prosecutor, and the presiding judge. At one point, you almost expect her to bang the gavel herself. It is one of those scenes that leaves you wondering whether anyone involved in writing this series has ever stepped inside a courtroom, watched a legal drama, or even skimmed through a YouTube clip of a trial. And this is where Blood Sisters Season 2 completely exposes Nollywood's continued inability to stage compelling courtroom drama. Court scenes are supposed to be battlegrounds of intellect and strategy. The best legal thrillers from Hollywood understand this. Whether it's A Few Good Men, The Lincoln Lawyer, Primal Fear, or The Verdict, the tension comes from sharp exchanges, clever questioning, buried secrets, and the constant feeling that everything can change with a single answer. The courtroom becomes a stage where words are weapons. None of that exists here. Instead, the court scenes in Blood Sisters feel like poorly rehearsed stage plays populated by lawyers who seem to have graduated from the University of Plot Convenience. Nobody objects. Nobody strategically dismantles testimony. Nobody exposes contradictions. There is no suspense, no intrigue, no intellectual warfare, just endless speeches, convenient revelations, and lawyers who stand around looking confused while witnesses practically conduct the proceedings themselves. What's even more astonishing is the amount of screen time dedicated to these sequences. The series keeps dragging viewers back into the courtroom only to deliver one uninspired scene after another. Every appearance of a lawyer becomes an exercise in lowering expectations. These aren't legal professionals. They are glorified extras dressed in wigs and gowns, reciting lines while the script desperately hopes nobody notices how absurd everything is. By the end, the courtroom scenes are not merely weak, they are catastrophic. They lack the tension of a thriller, the intelligence of a legal drama, and even the basic procedural authenticity required to make viewers suspend disbelief. What should have been the engine driving the series instead becomes one of its greatest embarrassments. For a show that spends so much time inside the courtroom, Blood Sisters Season 2 demonstrates an almost impressive determination to avoid everything that makes courtroom drama compelling. The result is not cinematic, it is not intense, it is not even particularly believable. It is merely loud, lazy, and painfully amateurish. Some may dismiss these complaints as nitpicking, but they are merely symptoms of a much larger disease afflicting Blood Sisters Season 2. These are not isolated mistakes. They are evidence of a production so fundamentally confused that maintaining any suspension of disbelief becomes an exercise in futility. Scene after scene reminds you that what you are watching is not a living, breathing world, but a collection of poorly thought out creative decisions stitched together with reckless confidence. The illusion collapses even further once you factor in the tastelessly exaggerated wardrobe choices. Katehensha's Uduak Ademola, for instance, spends much of the series dressed as though she wandered out of a Halloween gala themed around comic book supervillains. Between the distractingly elaborate hairstyles, the overcooked makeup, and costumes that scream for attention in all the wrong ways, subtlety is treated as an enemy to be defeated rather than an artistic virtue to be embraced. Then there are the prison and courtroom sequences where authenticity is apparently regarded as an optional luxury. One is left wondering whether the filmmakers genuinely expected Nigerian audiences to accept prison uniforms that look as though they were borrowed from the wardrobe department of Orange is the New Black, complete with long-sleeved thermal undershirts that have absolutely no place in a Nigerian correctional facility. Equally baffling are the lawyers who stroll up to the bench and practically testify on behalf of witnesses as though they are guest stars in a bargain bin version of Law and Order. This is not artistic license. It is creative carelessness masquerading as sophistication. To its credit, the sentencing sequence offers the faintest glimpse of an interesting conflict between Sarah and Kemi. Unfortunately, even that potentially compelling thread is so underdeveloped that it feels less like a carefully planted narrative seed and more like an accidental byproduct. The endless courtroom scenes that surround it are exhausting, not because legal dramas are inherently dull, but because these particular scenes expose an almost alarming lack of research. And that, perhaps, is the greatest sin of Blood Sisters Season 2. It does not merely get things wrong, it gets them wrong with such confidence that one suspects nobody involved ever paused to ask whether any of this remotely resembles reality. The series desperately wants to evoke Hollywood-style prestige drama, yet it understands neither the discipline nor the attention to detail required to pull it off. What remains is an awkward imitation, a legal thriller assembled from half-remembered episodes of Law and Order and Orange is the New Black, filtered through creative choices so bizarre that they often provoke laughter when suspense was clearly the intended reaction. By the time the credits roll, one is left with the uncomfortable feeling that more effort was spent on wigs, costumes, and melodramatic speeches than on the far less glamorous task of making any of it believable. I would have preferred to focus on the performances, but Blood Sisters Season 2 never quite earns that privilege. There is simply too much narrative clutter, too much creative noise, and too little coherence to isolate anything resembling a meaningful acting showcase. Whatever the cast attempts is ultimately swallowed by a production that seems determined to undermine itself at every turn. Even so, Katehensha's Uduak Ademola is difficult to defend. Basic logic appears to be the first casualty of her character's staging. A wealthy high-profile matriarch inexplicably wandering alone to her son's gravesite without security or context is not dramatic irony, it is narrative negligence. It is the kind of scene that doesn't just stretch believability, it quietly snaps it in half and expects the audience not to notice. Her confrontation with Uncle B's son fares no better, collapsing what should have been tension into awkward staging and baffling tonal choices. Instead of weight or consequence, the scene delivers confusion dressed up as drama. By the final episode, the series appears to abandon even the pretense of spatial or narrative logic. Events unfold with such disregard for continuity and geography that viewers are left grasping for orientation that simply isn't there. Sarah and Kemi's final movements feel less like character decisions and more like directional guesswork, as though they are wandering toward a destination the writers themselves never bothered to define. At one point, their journey becomes so unclear it is almost comical. One almost expects a Satnav voice to cut in and clarify whether they are heading to justice, escape, or possibly Ghana via Third Mainland Bridge, because the script certainly offers no distinction between any of them. And that is ultimately the most damning verdict on Blood Sisters Season 2. It does not fail in a conventional sense. It simply dissolves into confusion, dressed up as ambition. The kind of show where you stop asking what will happen next and start wondering whether anything that has already happened was ever properly thought through. By the end, it doesn't provoke outrage or even disappointment. It provokes detachment. The rare kind of television that doesn't just test your patience, it quietly convinces you that leaving the room might be the most coherent narrative decision available. In summary, Blood Sisters Season 2 is a disjointed, poorly executed mess of a series where very little, if anything, works. The characters are thinly written, lacking both credibility and emotional depth, while the central figures drift through the story with no convincing sense of purpose or direction. The writing and direction feel fundamentally mismatched with the demands of the story they are trying to tell. There is an obvious absence of narrative discipline and an even more troubling absence of restraint. The dialogue, often reduced to predictable Nollywood-style one-liners, only deepens the sense that subtlety and sophistication were never part of the creative blueprint. Ultimately, the series feels less like a completed work and more like a collection of ideas that were never properly developed, let alone unified. And in truth, if you have not seen it, you are not missing a cultural moment or a must-watch thriller. You are simply avoiding a drawn-out exercise in frustration. Some shows demand attention. This one generously offers you the option to skip it entirely without consequence. In this case, that is not a recommendation, it is a mercy. And now for my rating. Blood Sisters 2 scores a disappointing 1 out of 10. I'm definitely trashing this. Behind the mask, we see all. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the bell icon for notifications. Also, be sure to follow me on TikTok, WhatsApp channel, and Instagram at Dominus Cinephile for more movie and TV series reviews. Dominus Cinephile signing out.